What happens when a cunning gold digger thinks she's about to score the ultimate prize, only to realize she's been played from the very start? Meet Harold Whitmore, a sharp-witted retired professor living in his beloved home for nearly 50 years. But when a seemingly sweet woman named Vanessa enters his life, things take a dark turn. She's not after companionship. She's after his house, his assets, and everything he owns. But what Vanessa doesn't know? Harold isn't as frail or clueless as she thinks, and by the time she realizes she's been outplayed, it's already too late. Deception, suspicion, a trap set by the very man she tried to con. Stay tuned, because this is the story of how one elderly man outsmarted a scheming gold digger and sent her packing. Before we continue, make sure to like the video and subscribe the channel so the community can grow, and we can bring you more stories like this. Now, let's get into it. It was a crisp autumn morning in Maplewood, the kind of day where golden leaves fluttered lazily to the ground, and the scent of freshly brewed coffee drifted from the corner cafe. At the heart of this quiet suburban town stood a grand old house, weathered but dignified, much like its owner, Harold Whitmore. Harold, a retired history professor in his 70s, had lived in that house for nearly 5 decades. It held the echoes of laughter from his late wife, the memories of his children growing up, and the comfort of a life well lived. But what Harold didn't know, at least not yet, was that someone had set their sights on his beloved home. Someone with a charming smile, a calculating mind, and an insatiable greed. Her name was Vanessa Cole. A woman in her early 30s, Vanessa had perfected the art of deception. With striking red hair, designer clothes, and a carefully rehearsed air of innocence, she was a professional gold digger, one who had spent years conning wealthy, lonely men out of their fortunes. And now she had chosen Harold as her next target. 3 weeks earlier, Vanessa had met Harold at the Maplewood Public Library, a place he visited religiously every Thursday afternoon. She played her part well, pretending to struggle with a stack of books until they tumbled to the floor right at his feet. Harold, ever the gentleman, had helped her pick them up. "Oh, thank you so much," Vanessa had gushed, flashing a grateful smile. "You're such a lifesaver." Harold chuckled, waving off her gratitude. "Just an old habit of mine. I used to be a professor. Helping students was part of the job." Her eyes widened with interest. "A professor? That's amazing. I've always loved history, but never had anyone to explain it properly." And just like that, she had hooked him. Over the next few weeks, Vanessa worked her magic. She visited Harold at the library, showing an uncanny interest in his stories. She brought him home-cooked meals, claiming she had accidentally made too much. She even offered to help with small errands, slowly ingratiating herself into his life. But Vanessa wasn't doing this out of kindness. She had done her research. Harold was a widower with no close family. His house, a charming Victorian-style mansion, had skyrocketed in value over the years. If she played her cards right, she could get her name on that deed before Christmas. 5 weeks later, Vanessa had moved into Harold's house. Officially, she told people she was helping him with chores since he was getting older. Unofficially, she was laying the groundwork for her biggest con yet. Harold, however, was no fool. He had started noticing little things. How Vanessa's compliments always seemed to steer toward his house. How she asked questions about his will. How she faked concern over his health. When, in reality, he was still spry enough to outwalk her in the park. And so, Harold decided to play along, while setting a trap of his own. If you're yet to like the video and subscribe, make sure to do that now. 2 weeks later, Harold sat in his leather armchair by the fireplace, pretending to doze off as Vanessa paced the living room. She thought he was asleep, which meant she felt free to make phone calls she normally wouldn't in front of him. I know, she whispered harshly, but it's taking longer than I expected. The old man's stubborn." "No, he hasn't put me in the will yet, but he will. He just needs a little more convincing." Harold kept his breathing slow and steady, masking the fire that had ignited in his chest. So she wasn't just after his house, she was after everything. Vanessa's voice softened, dripping with fake sympathy. Poor thing. He's just so lonely. It won't be long now. She paused, then let out a small laugh. Of course I'll get the deed. He trusts me completely. Harold nearly smirked. If she only knew. 3 days later, Vanessa prepared Harold's tea with an extra touch of sweetness, 3 drops of an herbal supplement that made him feel sluggish, disoriented. Not enough to be obvious, just enough to make him doubt himself. Harold, honey, she cooed, sitting beside him on the couch, have you ever thought about making things easier for yourself? You're still so independent, but wouldn't it be nice to have someone to handle all the paperwork? Like, say, putting the house in both our names? Harold blinked as if confused. Oh, I hadn't thought of that. Vanessa squeezed his hand. I just want to take care of you. If something were to happen, you wouldn't want to leave all this in legal limbo, would you? She expected him to agree. Instead, Harold frowned. I should probably talk to my lawyer. Vanessa's smile faltered. Oh, don't be silly. Lawyers just complicate things. We could go to the county office tomorrow and take care of everything. Harold rubbed his temple. Maybe. Let me sleep on it. The next morning, Harold woke up early, his mind sharp despite Vanessa's nightly remedies. He'd poured out his tea the night before, switching it with plain chamomile. Now it was time to act. Vanessa, he called as she entered the kitchen, perfectly made up at 7 a.m., clearly expecting a victory. I've been thinking about what you said, about making things easier. Her face lit up. Oh, Harold, that's wonderful. He nodded. Yes, that's why I've invited my attorney over to help us with the paperwork. The color drained from Vanessa's face. Your attorney? Yes, if we're going to do this, we should do it properly. A knock sounded at the door. Vanessa flinched. Harold smiled. That must be him now. 30 minutes later, Vanessa sat stiffly on the couch, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles turned white. Across from her, Harold's attorney, Richard Lawson, a sharp-eyed man in his 60s, adjusted his reading glasses and flipped open a leather-bound folder. So, Richard said, scanning the documents, Harold tells me you've been discussing adding your name to the deed of the house? Vanessa forced a warm smile, though her pulse was racing. Yes, just to make things easier for him, of course. Richard nodded slowly. Of course. He glanced at Harold. And you're sure this is what you want? Harold put on his best dazed expression, the one Vanessa had been trying to cultivate with her little remedies. He scratched his head. Well, Vanessa's been such a help. I suppose it makes sense. Vanessa beamed. Exactly. It's all about making sure Harold doesn't have to stress over paperwork. We wouldn't want him worrying about complicated legal matters at his age. Richard raised an eyebrow. Interesting. He flipped to another page. You know, Harold, there's something important we need to discuss first. Harold frowned. What's that? Well, Richard said, looking directly at Vanessa, given that you're planning to add her to the deed, I went ahead and did a little background check. Vanessa's smile froze. A background check? She repeated, her voice a touch too high. Richard nodded, pulling out another folder. Standard procedure for something this significant. And you won't believe what I found. Vanessa's throat went dry. That seems unnecessary. Oh, but it is necessary, Richard said coolly. For instance, did you know that Vanessa Cole isn't your real name? Harold feigned surprise. It's not? Richard shook his head. Her legal name is Vanessa Marks. She's been married twice, both times to elderly men who mysteriously signed over property to her before their deaths. Harold turned to Vanessa, his expression one of well-practiced bewilderment. Is that true? Vanessa let out a breathy laugh. Oh, Harold, that's ridiculous. Whatever Richard found must be a mistake. Those were just misunderstandings. Richard ignored her. Not to mention the fraudulent credit accounts opened in their names after they passed away, and the lawsuits filed by their families. Harold's face darkened. My goodness. Vanessa stood abruptly. This is outrageous. You have no right to. Richard folded his hands calmly. Actually, we do. Because Harold had me look into this weeks ago. Vanessa's breath caught. She turned to Harold, eyes wide. You knew? Harold finally dropped the act. He sat up straighter, his sharp, knowing gaze cutting through her like a knife. Oh, sweetheart, he said, his voice laced with quiet amusement. I've known all along. 5 minutes of stunned silence. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. Her perfectly rehearsed charm flickered, replaced by a flash of pure panic. She was cornered, and she knew it. Harold leaned back in his chair, hands folded over his stomach, looking more alert and powerful than he had in weeks. You didn't think an old professor like me would catch on, did you? Vanessa's breath came quick and shallow. I don't understand. Why would I suspect you? Harold finished for her, tilting his head. Oh, I don't know. Maybe it was the way you accidentally ran into me at the library, pretending to love history when you barely knew who Julius Caesar was, or the way you started slipping things into my tea, thinking I wouldn't notice. Richard cleared his throat, opening another document. And speaking of noticing, Harold had the tea tested last week. The results came in this morning. He slid a paper across the table toward Vanessa. Turns out, you've been drugging him with mild sedatives, not enough to be fatal, just enough to make him doubt himself. Vanessa's hands trembled. That's insane. I love Harold. I was just looking out for him. Harold chuckled, the sound low and knowing. Oh, I'm sure you were. Looking out for my house, my will, my bank account, everything but me. Vanessa's eyes darted toward the door, calculating her chances of escape. Richard noticed and smirked. Oh, don't worry. We're not calling the cops just yet. Vanessa's head snapped up. You're not? Harold exchanged a glance with Richard before shaking his head. No, that would be too easy. And besides, you haven't technically stolen anything yet. Relief flickered across Vanessa's face, but it was short-lived. Harold leaned forward. Instead, I thought I'd let you decide how this ends. Vanessa's throat tightened. What? What do you mean? Richard pulled out another document. This is a legal agreement stating that you voluntarily leave this house today and never contact Harold again. If you sign it, we won't press charges for attempted fraud, drugging, or financial manipulation. Vanessa scoffed, trying to regain control. And if I don't? Harold smiled. Then we take all this, he gestured toward the damning paperwork, to the authorities, and I'm sure they'll be very interested in hearing about your past husbands. Vanessa went completely still. The game was over, and she knew it. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with shaking hands, she grabbed the pen and scrawled her signature at the bottom of the document. Richard nodded in satisfaction, collecting the papers. Good choice. Harold stood, walking to the front door and opening it wide. Now, be a good girl and get the hell out of my house. Vanessa hesitated, her mask cracking, but she had no moves left. With a final glare, she grabbed her purse, stormed out, and disappeared down the street. Harold shut the door behind her, exhaling slowly. Richard smirked. That was impressive. Harold chuckled. You don't teach history for 40 years without learning how to spot a con artist. And with that, he sat back down, picked up his untouched cup of tea, and enjoyed his first peaceful morning in weeks. In life, predators come in many forms, some with threats, others with smiles. But the smartest people don't just trust blindly. They observe, they listen, and they act when the time is right. Harold didn't let Vanessa take advantage of him because he saw the warning signs early. He stayed one step ahead, played along, and set the perfect trap. This story is a reminder that wisdom isn't just about knowledge, it's about awareness. No matter your age, never ignore red flags. Protect what's yours, trust carefully, and remember, the best way to beat a manipulator is to make them think they've already won. Make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on post notification to be the first to know when interesting and lesson-packed stories like this one drop.